Okay, while you find your seats, I would like to say good evening and welcome to the KTH School of Architecture and our public program of events and guest lectures. My name is Björn Allemark and I run these things. I would just like to take the opportunity to thank and introduce Elizabeth Hutz, a long-time friend of all things Irish and a long-time friend of Shelley Mcnamara. And she's been very important for this collaboration of the exhibition opening tonight and also for this lecture happening. So, Elizabeth, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Björn. Thank you. Her Excellency, the Ambassador of Ireland, ladies and gentlemen, welcome. Grafton Architects was founded in 1978 in Dublin by Yvonne Farrell and Shelley Mcnamara. And as you know well, Grafton Architects are winners of numerous international awards, including World Building of the Year Award 2008 for the building for the University of Bocconi in Milan, and they got the Silver Lion in Venice 2012. And they're currently working on competitions. They won in Lima, Toulouse, Paris, Dublin, and London. What you might not know is that their excellency in making architecture has a parallel in teaching at UCD, Mendrisio, Lausanne, at the Louis Kahn chair at Yale, and Kenzo Tange chair at Harvard. And I think why I'm really happy to see Shelley here is because their work is of the kind that changes and explores architecture with a really deep cultural connection and impact. And I'd say that this impact is both on a physical level through spaces that inventively reinterpret the very sense of place, and also on a social and metaphysical level, as it invites to new ways of seeing and using space while still relating to the existing. They know the way of fusing the new with the existing, the already known with the unexpected. It is like this. Since the beginning, their practice has been involved in making architecture part of a truly cultural commitment. And when I first encountered their work back in 1997, I was really taken by the way they handled a low-budget school with the same passion and architectural inventiveness as a prestigious commission for Trinity College. I've had the fortune and honor to write about several of their buildings over the years, but each time it's been a real challenge to do them justice in text. Because architecture, as you know, when it's real and when it hits you, it's way beyond words. Because, as Jean-Luc Godard said, it's not where you take things from, it's where you take them to. I'm delighted now to give the floor to Shelley Mcnamara of Grafton Architects. Thank you.
Thank you, Elizabeth, for that beautiful introduction. I should say that Elizabeth was one of our first supporters outside of Ireland and believed in us when perhaps many others didn't, and we're always grateful for that. Just before I start, because there's an exhibition outside which I think is a very important exhibition, and I didn't know anything about it before I came. These are the Irish architects that are exhibiting in your foyer, and I was reading about it, and what I found kind of challenging, it's a piece that John McLaughlin had written, was that he was saying that there was not really any connection between our generation and this generation of architects. And speaking to one of the architects who showed me around, Lawrence Lord, he said there wasn't really any connection between them either in any kind of direct way or in terms of working together. But what's interesting is seeing the way that they're starting to do things which, in a sense, when we started, there was a deep recession in Ireland, and where we had to make projects out of nothing, and they're doing the same thing in a really stimulating, I think, and fantastic way. And perhaps in Sweden, it's not always that kind of economic climate or cultural climate that you have, but we find that we've been through 3 recessions, so you have to get used to it as an architect. But I find it really encouraging, and I'd like to applaud the work that's in the foyer outside. So, Björn asked me for a title, and he asked me to talk about architecture and education. The title I chose was Imagining the Real, and this image is the floating island of Laputa from Gulliver's Travels by Jonathan Swift, Irish writer. And we often look to this image for fun, but also to think about the kinds of worlds that we try to imagine, and how the imagination starts out with contradictory intentions of making a floating island, perhaps, and a floating island with roots, which this one has. And also reading about photography, which I found really interesting recently, reading about one of my favorite photographers, Saul Leiter, where they talk about the many forms of memory that we have, but the form of memory that the sensory memory is the briefest, that somehow it's the memory that's fleeting and that it's hard to capture. And I suppose that brought to mind the way we work as architects. We work in a scientific and a strategic way, but we also have to capture those disappearing memories, perhaps in the way that photographers do. And I suppose in order to do that, we have to mix the rational with the irrational, and we have to mix the instinctive with the strategic. And in that sense, I suppose I'm going to focus on that side of work this evening, the process of imagining the real, because it's a very chaotic process in a sense, getting from the imagined to the real. And just, I suppose as architects, we all use these kind of hieroglyphic diagrams to describe what are imagined worlds, and we spend our time trying to get from these imagined worlds to reality. And it was very interesting this evening looking at the students' work, Elizabeth's studio's work, and a lot of the students were talking about fragments. And this is something that really interests me, both in terms of the way of working, but also in terms of the presence that fragments have, both in terms of ruins and in terms of the fragments of the future which we make in our searchings. And I suppose this image of Siracusa, the Duomo, which is an amazing combination of Greek temple and Baroque, one subsumed into the other, and it becomes a collage of fragments which assumes a new presence by virtue of its collage, and that's over the thing of time. But A.S. Byatt talks about the breathings of the words being interchangeable in language, and she talks about fragments of words and fragments of language maintaining their meaning even in a ruinous state. And in a sense, maybe we start making new projects, working in a way we're kind of working to the future from the fragments of influence, be it in our case, just say fragments of things that we look at, like Louis Kahn's Salk Institute, or the Vila Nova Artigas buildings in Sao Paulo, this amazing sense of structure trapping landscape, or the Lina Bobardi building in Sao Paulo, which I visited just a few weeks ago and was really challenged by the radical quality of this work. And it really does have that sense of imagining a new world and building a new, radically different world. And the other fragments, I suppose, we think about are the fragments of the physicality of the places that we're in. This photograph by Sudek in Prague, a cathedral in Prague, where it really feels like light in the space is liquid. And then when we went to Lima, that the liquid becomes light because the liquid refracts the light in Lima to the degree that you can barely open your eyes. So I suppose what I'm saying is, and maybe it's also interesting being in a school of architecture, that very often students think that we know what we're doing all the time, but of course we don't. We're all the time searching through bringing these fragments of sensation and memory and influence and trying to structure these fragments into a cohesive construct, which is the new world that we're trying to make in the making of new buildings. And just talking about where I come from, coming from Ireland, from Dublin, and many of the projects that I'm going to show this evening are outside of Ireland, and this is partly to do with the stage we're at in our work, but it's also to do with the fact that there was no work in Ireland for the past, from our point of view, for the past 6 or 7 years. But what we feel really strongly about is that we feel equipped to work in places outside of Ireland because we are steeped and rooted in our own culture. And also I really like this quote by Ernesto Rogers, tradition as an act of collective awareness. And even though in the case of the rebuilding of Milan after the war, which Ernesto Rogers was very prominent in leading, they talk about difference, but that at the same time there was a cultural connection in the work of those architects at that time in terms of a vision. And I suppose that thing of the collective culture is something that's really important in the making of an architecture. And it's also really important in the running or the life of an office. A photograph of Grafton Architects and the hands that go into the making of projects. And this always reminds me of Toscanini talking about an orchestra and how the musicians play better and excel when playing in a group, and in a sense being an architect in the collective atmosphere of the office is that sense of being in an orchestra and each person raising the spirit of the other. And we call this our ideas wall. So when we very often when we're starting a project, everybody in the office who's interested puts something on the wall as part of the pot, part of the stew, so to speak, in terms of trying to find the core of the project. And we're not just steeped in our own culture. Like all architects, we look to Europe and to the past and to the future and to the world. And this building many years ago we found absolutely extraordinary. Your building here in Stockholm by Celsing. And we'd never really seen a building with such a strong geological presence, an office building with this kind of prehistoric presence. And we found this incredibly important when we were doing a number of buildings, but particularly the Department of Finance in Dublin, which was our first really public building outside of the lanes of Dublin or outside of the university walls of Dublin. And we tried to make this wall which might have that same depth and presence. And I suppose in a way we continued this kind of language of weight and mass in the medical school in Limerick, dealing with not just the sense of materiality, but also dealing with weather as part of the driving, literally part of the driving forces of the design of buildings. But when we came to Milan, we started to think in a different way, and I suppose that's what being given an opportunity at a different scale does, is that somehow all of the projects you've been doing up to that point can come together when there's more scope, when there's a larger opportunity, let's say. Although I'm contradicting myself, I also don't really believe that either in terms of architecture, because scale is not that relevant. You can achieve as much in the making of a wonderful window as you can in the making of a piece of city. But for us, the Milan project was important in that it started us to think about ground at a different scale, and we started to look at Jorn Utzon and the way that he made an artificial island for the Sydney Opera House. So we were really thinking about ground as geography, and thinking about the piece of city in Milan as a piece of geography. And part of our requirement was to place half of the accommodation below ground. And so we're also looking at these wonderful buried churches in Ethiopia, as well as looking at the Salk Institute. But the idea was quite a simple one in a sense, which was that we would make artificial ground, which would be a new landscape, an erupting territory, which is the top left-hand sketch, and that above that the world of the professors, there's research offices for 1,000 professors, that would float above the city. And that was also influenced by the rooftop of the Duomo, which is a wonderful man-made mountain hovering over the city, and it's extraordinarily theatrical and has this wonderful presence in the city. So there was also this sense of ground and sky, that we would carve the ground and that we would make a kind of a sky world which would hover over that ground. And the site is just outside of the Spanish walls, about half an hour's walk from the Duomo. And the other thing I suppose that was really important for us was that the floor of the city of Milan has an incredible presence, because it's made of very solid granite, and unfortunately it's disappeared from around our site now, but at the time that we came to this site, the roads were made of this very heavy stone. And we started to think about the floor of the city washing its way through this university. And we won the competition apparently because we placed the most public room in the noisiest corner, the most public supposedly to be the quietest room, which is the auditorium for 1,000 people. And we placed this at the corner, the busy corner of the city, as a kind of symbol for the presence of the university. And we were doing what we called structuring space. And this is the term we enjoy because it somehow takes you back to the skeletal moves, the kind of initial boniness of a project. What is it that structures it? What is it that structures something of this scale? And the thing that structured this project for us was this sky world, which would span between the corridors which lead to the offices, something quite, you could say, simple, and that this matrix of the sky world would, with courtyards and voids, would allow light into the public world of the conferences below. And the way that we would structure the space would allow us to manipulate the soffit of the upper world and the way it is suspended over the lower world. And at that time we were really interested in the relationship between architecture and infrastructure. And again, it's some of the words used in the exhibition in the foyer is an interest in open-endedness. And it's something that Walter Benjamin writes very beautifully about, that the architect can design spaces where the unexpected can happen. And this was in our minds, that we would design a university like a kind of series of bridges or viaduct structures, and that this large-scale structure would support a world. I think this is actually Elizabeth's photograph of the building in Milan. And what's really interesting is that you can't see the building, which is just to the right-hand side of the image. And the street is a noisy, ordinary street. It's not one of those glamorous fashion streets in Milan, but it has this lovely, gritty, popular feel to it, which we grew to really love. And these are the noisy trams which pass by our auditorium. And then the building becomes more visible as you walk along this street, Viale Bligny, and you see the folds of the upper world stitching into the large-scale auditorium below, which then, when you turn, rises out of the ground and allows the citizen to see into the world of the university. One of the things that was very important was in terms of the reading of the city, and I suppose it goes back also to Saul Leiter's way of somehow depicting streets in New York, where you get a real sense of the sensation of the city. And this is something that painters do extremely well, where what's depicted is the sensation of a place, not just the grain or the structure or whatever. But and we found that the sensation of Milan was that you had this very hard city, very hard on the outside, and then you moved to very bright and airy and fresh interiors. So from this sensation came this idea of this crusted edge, and then within that solid form, so to speak, that we would carve out spaces below ground, and as well as suspending spaces above ground. So this is the foyer of the auditorium, the cantilevered auditorium. It cantilevers 20 meters to meet the street. And the reason for that wasn't really to do with heroics of engineering. It was really a wish to open the university to the city, to somehow draw the life of the city into the university. And there's something about breaking a solid. Somehow the kind of violent eruption of that auditorium leaves a kind of, it's like a crack in the solid, the way a rock splits, and that leaves a void in which unexpected things hopefully can happen. And when we see it full of people, and when we witnessed the way that space changes with the time of day, what's wonderful is that sometimes the glass is very reflective. And then when the light moves around, the glass disappears and the city and the interior become one. And there's something very primal about standing in a space like that, because you sense the forces of gravity. And I suppose it's something we're really interested in, is that ancient kind of sense of moving within the play of the forces of gravity. And then you get this sense of waiting, of this void in the city, waiting for something to happen. And carved spaces which take you from 9 meters below ground. This is the students' stepped ramp, taking you from bicycle parking down to the lecture theatres, or a stepped courtyard taking light down 9 meters below ground. And sometimes this is the same space. Sometimes that space is really moody, and sometimes it's really sunny and is a socializing space for the professors and the students. And in terms of the thing of digging into the ground, the use of reflective marble to reflect light and to bring lightness deep into the body of the building. And one of the discoveries that we made, which we found really a real sort of pleasure, was that while the building seems very rigorous and rational, the dynamics, let's say, of the manipulation of the volumes and the section somehow obliterates the line between inside and outside and liberates diagonal views more so than axial views. So it does feel like a kind of three-dimensional labyrinth, which I suppose is what we were thinking about in terms of it being a place of education. This is the stairs for the professors, which feels like it's hanging from above as opposed to the carved stairs of the students going down to the auditoria. And this is the result of the structure where we used that infrastructural series of wall beams which I showed the diagram of, and we hung the offices from the roof, so they really feel like they're suspended. This is the entrance courtyard, so you move from the street under a covered space into an outdoor space, an indoor space, outdoor space again. So that whole sequence of inside and outside is blurred. So this project was I suppose an idea about thinking about a university as a place of exchange, as a kind of marketplace, as a city in miniature. It was very much part of the legacy of Milan and our understanding of rationalist architecture. I mean, we have so much to be thankful for in terms of what we've learned from Italian architecture for decades and millennia. And we felt somehow relatively comfortable in that context, and looking at how that infrastructure supports these kind of trays of people. The top right is the street level, then we've 5 meters below ground, and we have 9 meters below ground with the lights still tumbling down. And the competition image, which describes our wish to somehow make a connection between the citizen of the city and the world of the university, that corner on a very misty, foggy Milanese evening, of which there are a lot in the autumn and the winter, that somehow it would attract the citizens of the city, and that somebody coming home on a wet evening could see into the university, which they do on this winter's evening, where there's dancers in that foyer space under the 20-meter cantilever. And then during the day, where it acts, where parents are trying to see what their children are doing down in that sunken foyer. So it is a kind of window that does attract not just the life of the university, but attracts the life of the city. And then going back to Sudek, this photograph is called Nightwalker, and he talks about the architect being like a kind of secret detective. And we feel very much the same as architects, that we, and in a sense, Manuel de Sola Morales, who writes beautifully about the reading of cities, he talks about the architect, again, in exactly that same way, needing to approach a city like a detective and to discover the clues in the skin of the city. And he also talks about the need to record cities in a way which will equip us to respond to them, and makes that very same point about recording the sensation of cities and the materiality of cities. And moving to the next project, which is in Toulouse, which again is a university building. It's a University of Economics, which is what the University of Bocconi is. It's much smaller. This is not Toulouse, this is Albi, which is about 1 hour north of Toulouse, and it's the most extraordinary brick building that we have ever seen. It was visited and drawn by Louis Kahn, and it's designed by a Spanish military engineer and architect, and it has this amazing presence and potency. And it made us think, when we went to do the competition, we visited this building, and it really made us think about what we call edges and thresholds, how defensive or how welcoming a building could or should be. And while this building is definitely defensive, it's also welcoming by virtue, I suppose, of it not just being a defensive wall, but it has a sensuality and a form which makes people behave in the way that they are in that image. And in our response to the university in Toulouse, the bright orange rooms in this diagram are the conference rooms, which are the buried rooms in Milan. But here in Toulouse, we lifted them out of the ground to make a kind of wall through which the professors, who are in the pale pink in that diagram, could view the city. So we thought about the conference rooms as being like big stones, which would make the wall to Toulouse. Toulouse is a beautiful city. It's picturesque. It's like a broken heart. Unlike Milan, it has a river and a canal, a very big, beautiful river, the Garonne and the Midi Canal. And it was so picturesque in a sense that we, unlike Milan in a sense, we felt completely ill-equipped to deal with this kind of context, and it really challenged us in terms of how we would find a starting point. And we started with these fragments about circulation, and probably the middle drawing, which was about all the brick buttresses that we found in Toulouse, started to really make us think about buttresses and thinking, I suppose, about how we might make a new building which might be a collage of elements that we found in Toulouse. And the sunflower drawing was to do with sunflowers in the fields, but also to do with thinking about environmental control and how we would deal with the fact that it's 40 degrees in the summertime, and how we would start to think about this environmentally. So looking at the buttresses of Toulouse, and also looking at the scale, the scale of the old Roman city has an absolutely miniaturized scale, with these tiny courtyards where the main window is to the sky. And so these were things we tried to remember and not forget and reuse in the making of a new project. The building is at the junction of the new and the old city, and it's at the bottom left-hand part of this drawing, overlooking the Midi Canal and overlooking the river. And again, it's also occupying a gap in a medieval wall, a brick medieval wall. It's a red brick city. It's called the Rose City. And this was the plan, the idea of these conference rooms acting like big boulders with these terraces, which would make big windows through which you could view the river and view the city. And the study model, which is about making 6 what we call feet, which are the 6 fire escapes, which make these big buttresses, which somehow plant the building solid on the ground, and then we inhale from these 6 buttresses to make courtyards and interstitial spaces onto which all the offices look. There's a forecourt space which is formed by what we call a sky cloister, and that makes the window to the sky, which was very important for us, that somewhere in that project that we would have a sense of coming through this introductory space, which would make a window to the sky. And through that forecourt you enter into the heart of the building, which is in fact external but protected from wind and rain. And we connected these buttress spaces with terraces and cloisters and courtyards. And the view from the public square, the student square, where you see the sky cloister and the connection through to the inner courtyard, which is the heart of the building, and the buttress of the adjacent Romanesque church with this beautiful brick surface, and we're using the same brick as the medieval wall of Toulouse. And environmentally, the other photograph we took when we were doing the competition was of this little girl standing in the Jacobin Cathedral, where she just stood in the sunlight. And we visited all these courtyards with no glass and open windows and the air flowing through. And these were really beautiful spaces, which is why we made the central hall of Toulouse external, protected from wind and rain, but with external staircases and having that same feel of what we found in the city. And here you see the gaps between the big conference spaces and the city, the choreographing of the city beyond. So because the staircases all the fire escape staircases are at the edges and form the edge of the building, the internal staircases can be open. And here we see the building taking its place in the skyline of Toulouse. So this building is under construction. And I just want to touch briefly on two new university buildings that we're doing. One is in brownfield site just outside of Paris, and the other is Kingston University in London. Building in a brownfield site we found extremely lonely, because we had always been in these very tight urban sites. And so we found that we had to think in a completely different way about this project. And because literally it's probably the 10th building that's going to be built, and the campus is planned over a 50-year lifespan. It's about the same size as Bocconi, but what we did was we compressed all the teaching and social spaces of the building into one half of the site in order to make a sense of urbanity, a sense of the collective. I suppose one of the things about educational institutions is that you learn by accident as much as by intent, and that thing of the overlapping of use and the spaces between, for us, is hugely important in any educational institution. So it's compressed to build to the maximum height and to make these social spaces, which are courtyards and lecture theatres, and then the space is released to make a garden, which is on real ground, in which there will be planted 100 trees. And in a sense, this is the first project that we've got involved in making a very repetitive, extensive facade. And something gave me courage recently. I was looking for it. I was reading Edith Sitwell's autobiography, and she writes beautifully about the making of poetry. And she says not only structure, but also texture are the parents of rhythm in poetry. Rhythm is one of the principal translators between dream and reality. And this is something we really worked with, are still working with, in the making of a repetitive facade, which is about making rhythm which opens and closes and makes a kind of a musical presence in the new street. And of course we were looking at Cordoba and the way that this compression and release happens in the city, in the making of the mosque and the garden. And we were also looking at the Bastide towns in France, and the diagonal relationship between the market square and the ecclesiastical square in these towns. And we were also looking, of course, at Tiragny. So this project is very much about rhythm, repetition, and about the making of a new environment, and it's the university as a kind of monastic form. In contrast, the university in Kingston is a completely different, let's say, challenge, and it was probably one of the most progressive educational briefs that we'd ever been given, which is about making a 24-hour library open to the whole community, not just the community of students, but to the community of Kingston. And it's also a mixed, it's library mixed with performance and exploratory teaching spaces. So it's a very different kind of building, and it's a very inspired vision of education. And we felt that this needed what we would call a loose fit. That it shouldn't be, that the architecture somehow shouldn't be too prescriptive, that the educational idea was about fluidity and openness, and that somehow we would find a way of making an architecture which would have that sense of fluidity and openness. So we started to think about warehouses and that kind of, in a sense, neutral structure which would allow this loose fit occupation to happen. And we were looking at Utsen's furniture showroom in Copenhagen, which we felt was really beautiful structure and spatially really dynamic, but at the same time just a simple, well, it's not that simple, but a simple frame structure. So this was how we interpreted the Utsen influence into making this big warehouse of ideas, which is using precast concrete and in situ concrete ribbed slabs, and making the sense of an open, fluid staircase and series of spaces. And the auditorium, again, one of the reasons why apparently we won this competition was because we thought about the auditorium as being a courtyard, that it wouldn't be a black box hidden away, that it would somehow act as the focus of the space, and that you could be in the library and see what's happening in the event space. It's not actually an auditorium, it's to be used for many different events. And sometimes it's interesting to bring the noisy and the quiet together, because visual overlap is possible even when you need acoustic privacy. And the worst thing in a university is to miss a really good lecture because you didn't know that it was on. So we just felt it's really important to know when there's something happening, and that everybody in the building would know, and that would create a sense of excitement throughout the building, and that people would be attracted to the space. So we took our dancers on stilts from Milan and put them in Kingston for this image. And this building also has the task of making a civic space, and it makes a colonnade, a kind of loggia, which addresses the Surrey County Hall opposite. So it is a warehouse of ideas, but it also has a civic role to play in terms of weaving the life of the town and weaving the life of the landscape in this case into the facade, and making this sense of external circulation and a very porous building which would invite the visitor and the stranger to enter. And in Lima, we thought about the university as an arena for learning. And this came for a number of reasons, partly to do with the shape of the site and partly to do with the conditions of the site. Lima, that's the foggy image I showed you earlier, because it's overlooking the Pacific, and it's at a junction of the hot and cold climates and air movement and water, and creates this fog which they call the belly of the donkey. And the belly of the donkey hangs over the city for, I think, maybe 60% of the year. It's also kind of an extraordinary city because it has this 40-meter cliff which separates the city from the sea, and there are just 2 or 3 green fingers which connect the sea to the city, and our building is on one of these green fingers. So we were very much taken by this cliff and the monumentality of the cliff, and the conditions of the site are probably described best in the top little sketch, where we have a really loud, hostile motorway to the north, which is where the sun is, because we're south of the equator. And it has a beautiful old residential quarter on the south called Barranco. So the conditions were such that it was completely imbalanced. And so the section became like a kind of arena or a stadium, where you would use the circulation of the building as the kind of shoulder to protect the teaching spaces of the building. But we were also interested in the cliff and how this new construct might feel like a continuation of the cliff, because, as I say, it's on that green finger, which is the bottom right-hand sketch, that it would somehow have that connection. And we were looking back to Le Corbusier and his drawings of infrastructure and buildings as motorways, and in our old Le Corbusier handbooks. And we were also looking at the work of a teacher of ours, Niamh Brown, who made a wonderful housing scheme backing onto a railway line in the 60s, and made this very hard edge facing onto the railway line, and then a very soft edge full of gardens where people could live. And of course the football stadium of Eduardo Soto de Moro in Braga. And we found it really exciting thinking about a university as a football stadium. And one of the things that I found visiting the Lina Bobardi building, the sports building in Sao Paulo, was that she has made a sports center, a community center, and it feels like it is an industrial silo. and just the challenging of typologies and thinking about a monument for people at play being like a grand industrial silo. It was incredibly strong in the Bobardi building. But at the time we were also looking at the work of Paulo Mendes de Rocha, and this is one of the first images of his work which we ever saw, which we found really compelling because of the space that it makes under the stadium, that it's not just the stadium and the pitch, but it's the socializing spaces and how people access the stadium, and the openness and the sense of presence of this structure. So we were thinking about all of these things, and this is our paper model, which describes this idea of making all the circulation and staircases overlook the motorway, and making the teaching spaces as a series of cascading gardens, which would overlook Barranco. This is the kind of image you do when you're doing a competition, and it's kind of a scary image. And we arrived very late in Lima one night, and I was asleep in the taxi, and I woke up and opened my eye, and this image was there about 9 stories high in a billboard, and it kind of gives you a certain kind of jolt when you see that at the scale of the city. But this was the section, the sketch section, which is about this very thing of leaning against or towards the motorway and making a series of cascading teaching spaces, the roofs of which would house the gardens which overlook Barranco. We also found that this shape works really well because it's seismic, so it has its feet very solidly set on the ground. And at the time we were also doing at the time of the competition, actually, we found this image which we found very encouraging, because there is a certain nervousness about making a project in Peru, given that you're coming from Ireland, and there's a worry about an arrogance at even thinking of doing so. But one of the things we found compelling about this image was the similarity between Machu Picchu and Skellig Mill in the Atlantic Ocean, and the fact that human beings have this need for intimacy within hostile landscapes, whether they're, in this case, the Skellig Mill is between the 6th and 10th century, and Machu Picchu is 15th century, and they're thousands of miles apart, but that there are certain similarities in the way that the landscape is occupied. And it's that there's a very interesting essay by William Curtis called Platform and Horizon, and he talks about these kind of places not having any middle ground, and the way that the human being hugs the earth in contrast with the huge horizon and the huge, sometimes hostile landscape beyond. And we were really thinking about Lima being like this, our site, that it was the hostility of the city as well as the attraction of the city, and the need to make the teaching spaces more intimate for that reason. And one of the again, the other fragments which we found really compelling were these handmade brick structures, which are man-made monuments called huacas. And they're places of ritual, but what we found astonishing is that they have a sense of the monumental, but not the sense of aggression or assertion or power. And they're made by families, by people, with handmade bricks. And there's something about that, about the relationship also between the intimate and the heroic. We were thinking also about from this thing of from ruin to realization, or from fragment to reality, when we were doing the Venice Biennale Common Ground exhibition, and this sketch goes from the idea of the piles of Venice, which is on the left-hand side, to the peaks of Skellig Mill or Machu Picchu. And we tried to we just won the competition in Lima, and so it was a very fresh project where we really didn't know where it was going to go. And we tried to make fragments of what we wanted this project to be, and they're in a sense they're like ruins of the future. You make these fragments and these ruins, but they're of a building that you're about to make, and not of something that has gone into decay. And again, that's something that's really interesting about building up a project from the parts and letting a project grow. So this plan of the university, it's a University of Engineering. It's large. It's the total length of the site is 300 meters, and the first phase I think is 150 meters, which is the part that's built. And you see all these conference rooms hugging the ground and making this big thick wall, which makes a kind of a protection to the motorway. So we made an artificial ground, in a sense, to set up this protective layer for the arrival spaces and the teaching spaces. And then there's the little grain of Barranco to the south. And the competition drawing of this building disappearing into the fog, which is for so much of the year of in Lima, and somehow the trapping of landscape within this large-scale infrastructure of staircases and galleries, and trying to see if we could make a concrete infrastructure which would connect with the colour of the cliff. What we discovered from going to and from Lima is that all concrete buildings in Lima become the colour of that cliff because of the sand from the desert, which is forever present in Lima. And looking at the gardens of the teaching spaces overlooking the city, and this was the competition image, which has since become more gentle in its experience but the idea was that students would always feel the presence of their city and that they could retreat into the gardens of the teaching spaces. And the nose of this building faces the Pacific, which is really good because the wind comes from the Pacific and blows right through all of the circulation space. The intended view from the motorway. And again, trying to imagine the sensation of the building in these images, we were really trying to capture what we thought the light would be in this space. And all of the circulation in this building, there are no corridors. The only internal rooms are the teaching spaces, and that's because it's a really moderate climate. It's in the 20s. It goes maybe down to 15 degrees up to 28 degrees, but it's incredibly moderate climate. And one of the things we were really surprised about is that of all the 65 entries in the competition, we were the only people who made external circulation, which is kind of puzzling. The other thing we did was, it's the University of Engineering, and we brought the laboratories into play like exhibition spaces. So the big room that you see with the big machine is a big engineering laboratory. So instead of trying to bury the dirty spaces, we were trying to use those as being the heart of the project, and then converting the competition section into the reality of the structure. And one of the things that we had to deal with dust, with noise and humidity. There's no waterproofing in Lima. There's no thermal insulation needed. It's, for an art architect, it's like being out to play. You don't have to worry about these things. You make an infrastructure within which people can teach and learn. And the little box you can see overlooking the motorway, it was very interesting working with an acoustician, trying to see how we could make that sense of openness between the university and the motorway, and at the same time deal with the noise of the traffic. So that edge to the motorway became more inhabited, which we think really improves the project. This was a more developed model, this kind of honeycomb cascading gardens overlooking Barranco and backing onto the motorway. And these are the images of the completed building, the first phase of the completed building taking up its place in this vibrant, dynamic, but also problematic city. And the sense of the space between these two elements, between the element of the the staircases to the motorway and the teaching spaces behind. One of the things that really surprised us was the quality of this space. We spent a lot of time scientifically working with our environmental engineers to make sure that the north light didn't enter the building, because we were really worried about the heat of the sun and the glare of the sun. And so when you're in this space, it's full of light, but you never see the sky. And what's extraordinary about it is that you've come through this very porous structure, but you feel like you're in something solid. And it's something that our clients, who are mining engineers, who are the people building and funding this University of Engineering, that they absolutely love. And of course you realize why they love it, because it feels like it's mined or it's carved. That was something that happened sort of accidentally. I mean, I suppose there are certain things that really surprise you in a project, and that's one of them, that we never realized how strong it would be to not see the sky but be in a space full of light. And the trapped gardens overlooking the motorway, this building is still ongoing. It's finished and occupied up to the 4th floor, but they keep on going. And the landscaping is being gradually carried out on the upper levels. And this is the sense of the bridges connecting the motorway edge to the teaching edge, and the light penetrating in shafts down to the lower level, and the scale of the student population within the space, and the scale of the building as it sits on the motorway. It's significantly lower than it was at competition stage, but better for that. And again, I suppose one of the things that we've learned from this project is that by thinking the way that we were thinking, which was a combination of pragmatic and strategic, really seriously thinking about the environmental potential and conditions, and also knowing from people in our office who'd been to Sao Paulo that culturally people live outside all of the time, that it's the climate and the culture is about being outside. So in a sense, we've made a building which has no interior, and we've made a building which has, because of its porosity, has a sense of openness to the city. It's in the context of many glass boxes, which, I mean, a lot of people both in Sao Paulo and in Lima, they really look to America for their identity, let's say, or their vision. And this building has a different presence because it has no facade, it has no interior except for the classrooms, and it has this sense of the making of artificial terraces which overlook Barranco, which is the residential quarter. I would just like to finish with something that I've read recently, and I find it really fascinating, and I don't quite know what it means, but I find it really stimulating, and maybe you would like it as well. And it was a piece written by John Rashman called Light Matters. And he says, architects often understand lightness as immateriality, but can we speak of another kind of lightness that complicates and displaces this familiar understanding? Can we talk about a spirit of lightness capable of moving in even the heaviest brute materials, of showing even the thinnest transparencies to be slow or weighed down? Can we speak of light materialities and heavy transparencies, a strange weightlessness of the earth itself? So it is that lightness is asked to come out. It is asked to invent another kind of abstraction than that of the immaterial geometric form, which takes us out from the gravity of locales, regions, and tradition. This lightness might undo its long identification with immateriality and transparency in architecture and find a new concept no longer opposed to that of the earth. Thank you.
Maybe I can start. I'm just wondering how you keep all your team, your equipe, because you work very hard. You don't have a huge office. I'm just wondering how you manage to recharge every time you have a commission.
What did you say? How to keep all our?
Yeah, how you keep your team recharging every time?
Yeah.
With
Well,
with
we have a
small
fantastic team, and I think teaching helps. A lot of people in the office teach, and we've been teaching all of our practicing lives except for maybe 3 or 4 years. And we found we were really scared doing the Milan competition because we really wanted to win and we didn't know how to win. And what we found, we were 12 people at the time, what we found, we had to do something very big and very fast because it was 10 times bigger than anything we'd ever done. And we found that we kind of ran it like a studio, that particular project. And it was the first time I realized that you learn about working together when you're teaching, and you learn how to see when somebody's not happy and move by their body language. Because you walk into a studio, you know immediately if somebody's not happy, and you have to find a way of making them happy. So I think it's Dermot Boyd from Dublin always says that the secret of having a good practice is to hire people who are better than you are, which is true. And so we do have that thing of trying to always find what people are best at and bringing that together. And none of us are good at everything. And it's to also find a balance in the office where you have a great variety. Like some people excel in one thing that somebody else is really not good at, and it's that combination that's wonderful. But I really do believe in the hands image, because there's a lot of discussion about is architecture, what is it? It's always the person or the two people that are credited. But it's Grafton Architects, from our point of view, is the studio, and it's that mix, that cocktail, that's what keeps us going and keeps it going. It's probably one of the things for you to look forward to as students. I mean, students, when you're a student, you're working alone, which is quite artificial in a sense. Whereas when you're in practice, you always have the pleasure of working with other people. So, and it's not just pleasure; it's actually survival. Because when you hit the depths of depression, which are quite regular, also, it doesn't go away, it helps to be buoyed up by other people's energy. It's really essential.
I haven't heard an architect speak so frankly about these different ways of thinking that are required at the same time, or together. Strategic, pragmatic, irrational. And you spoke of that very matter-of-factly. And certainly it's clear that you know how to create a project that can communicate. It's very clear. You can win the competition. You have the right idea. You have the right intuition. you have almost a strategic vision that you can communicate. But I think the work is different than other architects, because you work in the backward direction. You begin with something that's strategic, that's what you offer. Then it becomes more and more dense, more relentless, more complicated, more perfect, more intense. And I feel like that is what makes it so different. It's beginning somewhere familiar, because that strategic thinking is quite familiar, but it's going the other way. And I feel like this must be an extraordinary pressure, intellectual pressure within the office. You know where you're going, but you're not really going where you were originally pointing. You're going in the opposite direction. That's the way it seems, because the spaces are extraordinary. The reality is so much more extraordinary than the schematic propositions. And I feel like this is the thing. You are both strategic, pragmatic, and then the irrationality of doing something so intense, so, in a way, perfected.
Wow. Thank you. I don't think that's a question. Thank you. I really appreciate that. Thank you. I like the idea of going backwards, and it never feels like we know what we're doing, and it's very emotionally charged as well, because you become strategically fluent, but then the struggle is to hit that note, to literally hit the note that you feel is the right one for that particular condition in that particular place. It's probably one of the really liberating things about the Lima project was that we were really frightened going off to Lima, signing a contract with mining engineers that we didn't know. We could have lost our whole practice if we had been messed around, but we weren't, and they were really fantastic. But what we found is that their response to the building is astonishing. I mean, if we built a building like that in Ireland, we'd never get another project ever in our lives, I'm sure, because it wouldn't be appropriate, first of all, but it's just hit some note for them. They recognize it. It feels like it's theirs, and that's interesting. It's like they recognize something in it that feels like it belongs to them, and that's kind of astonishing. It's the biggest, I suppose, compliment, let's say.
Firstly, thanks for a brilliant lecture. I just have a question. I've been to your Bocconi building twice, and I absolutely love it. It's one of my favourite buildings in the world. But I was there this summer with 2 colleagues, and we noticed that there's some problem with the materials. And I'm just wondering, do you have any idea what's going on with the material on the facade of the building? They're doing some reparations there.
Sorry, which building are you speaking to?
The Bocconi.
Oh, Bocconi. Yeah. It's apparently we haven't quite got to the bottom of this, but apparently the codes for the relationship between the structure and the attachment of the stone were different at the time that we were building the building, and the codes have changed, and the tolerance in the movement joints of the structure, it's not the stone actually fixing that is problematic. It's the movement joints in the structure moved to a degree which was within the code built at the time, but they were worried about the effect on the stone. So it's part checking, part repair. So it's a protective measure. It's not a collapse.
Thank you.
Okay. Okay, I could jump in with one, if I may. Thank you for the lecture. It's quite simple, actually. I want to know if or what you've learned about creating learning environments or buildings for learning and teaching by being an educator yourself.
I think it really helped us because we're passionately interested in education and the dynamics of education. And something a younger architect in our office said recently, I thought was really quite profound. Actually, it was when we were doing the competition in Kingston, and he said that that if you go into let's say a lecture theatre, and it's a normal lecture theatre, you sit down and you're passive and you expect to receive information. If you go into a different kind of space, perhaps this kind of space, which is not immediately recognizable as a lecture theatre, that it prepares you to receive knowledge or information differently. And I think that probably one of the most important things is that I don't believe that places of education are for the consumption of knowledge. I think that places of education are to do with discovery and exploration. And I can't remember who it was that described a university or a school of architecture. Actually, it was Professor Hugh Campbell from Dublin talked about that a university should be a place where knowledge is tended to, like a garden, that it's kept alive, that it's already there, and we're the guardians of knowledge, and that we're not just the consumers of knowledge. And I find that fascinating idea that there's something there that you have to keep alive. You have to discover it and keep it alive. And those kind of ideas are really inherent in the way that we think, and it's also about opening up, not deformalizing things, but opening things up, because we all remember that time where somebody leant over our shoulder and said, "Why don't you do this?" And it changed your life practically. Or you saw something out of the corner of your eye, some project that really affected you. That it's a fluid thing. It needs to be structured, but it's also fluid. So I think the spatial environments within which learning can happen are central. One of the things that also surprised me about Lima was that when we first walked around the building with one of the clients, he said, "I'm very happy." He said, "I know that each student will be able to find him or herself in this place." So he was thinking about the student being alone, being able to be alone and find a place within a big place, which is also interesting, that it's not just always about being in the group, it's being able to find a place where you can stand back and observe. So I think it's about discovery and just make it where you discover knowledge for yourself, that you're not just being fed like in a cafe.
Thank you.
Shelley, thanks very much for the lecture. It was great, really fascinating also to see your work in different contexts and quite staggering scale sometimes, and how that seems to evolve how you think and how your practice is run. And you said something in the beginning that was, you felt you were quite comfortable to work in all these different contexts because you were so grounded in Ireland, which I thought was a very interesting comment also, I guess, from our own position. Can you explain that a little bit more? What exactly is that being grounded, and how does that actually make it possible for you to do projects, for example, in Lima?
The thing that explained that feeling to me most was speaking. I had to speak at an arts festival in Ireland, and this French man came up to me who translates the poetry of Hopkins into French. And we were talking about the process of translation, and he said that in order to translate, you have to go deeper into your own language to translate it into another language. So I suppose we feel we've learned the language of architecture in our own place. That's just, I'm not saying it's the only way to do it, but that's what our lives were made of. And I suppose from stitching and repairing and learning, and in a way it's more difficult to refresh and renew your own familiar culture than it is to see a strange culture. So in a sense, I think we spent maybe 25 years of looking in order to be able to see, in order to be able to renew or refresh. So it's almost as if we knew how to see. So we could see things in Milan, like a piece of pavement, or I don't know, the roughness of the stone or something. We could see it because we'd been looking for things to see, like you are, in your own place. And then, as a contradiction to that, Beckett said that the use of something like the use of foreign language was a way into primal sound. I think that's also very interesting, that it's both familiarity and foreignness. I'm contradicting, it's a contradictory answer, but there's things that are in my head.
Thanks again, Shelley. It was an amazing presentation. It's always good to see your work. I'm just thinking more on a practical point, taking up your note here on language.
I'm sorry, I can't hear you very well.
Sorry.
Yeah.
I'll talk a bit loud. Just taking up on a practical viewpoint, you're working in quite a number of countries at this stage in different languages. Almost architecturally, but also practically they are different languages. I'm wondering how you're putting out the drawings. Do you have an on-site architect, or is Grafton Architects putting the drawings out from Dublin, or do you use other architects?
Yeah. We learned a great lesson doing Milan because we thought we would have to have a local architect, and the client said one architect was enough, he didn't want another. So we did all the drawings in Dublin with a number of Italian architects who joined our team. And then it's very interesting because building in different countries is completely different. Like in Italy, as a foreign architect, I don't think you couldn't take things through construction because of the level of responsibility. You have to be everything. So we worked with project managers when we were on site. But the secret, I think, is to take the drawings as far as you can in your own office, in your own place. Which was what we've done in Toulouse and in Lima. In Toulouse, we have French architects working with us at construction stage, and in Lima, we had French architects working with us at pre-construction stage. So they took the drawings and I suppose, well, actually. Yeah, they oversaw the construction drawings. There weren't that many of them in Lima, I'm afraid, because we spent months trying to get the detailed drawings of the mechanical and electrical, and we discovered when we went they just didn't exist. They just keep on going, I don't know how. Yeah, we always have good foreign people, but never too soon.
Any final question or any final note from Elizabeth?
Okay, thank you, Elizabeth.
Thank you.